whole idea behind this meeting was to periodically touch base with the observing team as the co-lead for the data team, because obviously there's a lot of common interests. And in this one in particular, we're looking at Peter Pulsifer's contribution to be the data team's contribution, because he's really active in that space, and this helps us liaise with the Arctic Data Committee's data activities. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. And I guess, Sandy, a question for you. Do you want me to share the agenda and go through that, or would you like to do that in your next?
Actually, I think in the interest of time, if you just briefly flash the agenda up, I'll introduce our next topic, and then you can follow that by putting Hayo and Mary Beth's presentations up.
Great.
So we do have a pretty full agenda for the day, and it's really being shaped by the upcoming Arctic Observing Summit. We're going to immediately hear from Hayo and Mary Beth, and as Roberto alluded to, I'm also going to put the AOS a little bit in the context of the Say on Roads process that we've talked about on this call. For those who are interested in some of the logistics changes oriented towards the shifts in the AOS, those are actually down at the end of the agenda following some of the rest of our discussion. And so we'll have a lot of time to talk about those logistics shifts. Right now, we'll talk more just about the kind of content and organization of the AOS as it was intended. So Hayo and Mary Beth, please take it away.
Thanks. And I think Mary Beth was going to start. Hazel, do you want to share the slides for file number 1?
Yeah, as soon as they come up, I'll get rolling.
Okay. Yeah, if you have them pulled up.
Okay, here, let me just do it on my end. It'll be easier.
Yeah. Or I have them here now. Okay, perfect.
Whoa, okay, great. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because this is mostly background, and I think Hayo and Sandy have some more substantive things to get through. But as I mentioned earlier, the summit, we've been doing this biannually since 2013. The goal really is to support the design, implementation, coordination, sustained operation of an international pan-Arctic observing system of systems. And so this has been a collaborative activity. It's been quite comprehensive. We've had, over the years, representations from just about every discipline I can think of, with 1 or 2 exceptions that I think as we move forward in the future, we're going to need to start to engage, particularly biomedical and engineering. And the process has been very much community driven. So what are the different observational needs of different members of the Arctic community? And how can these be addressed collaboratively and across nations? So the participants have included stakeholders from all sectors: private sector, government, NGOs, academic, indigenous organizations and communities, as well as managers of systems. The forum really is designed to help us figure out how we can best optimize resource allocation and minimize gaps while avoiding duplication. And it is increasingly serving as a good workspace for developing solutions, recommendations, and making contributions. And I would add here that the recommendations from summits are now moving sort of up the food chain to higher government levels. The goal really is to communicate and support collaboration and coordination, and to get, I think, our different nations and agencies to work together so that we can build out a system that meets a broad spectrum of needs. So the first one, as I mentioned, was in 2013 in Vancouver, the second in Helsinki in 2014. As of 2014, we've been synchronizing these with Arctic Science Summit Week, so every other year in collaboration with ASSW. Fairbanks 2016, 2018 in Davos, and this year Not in Iceland, but online. These are the themes that we had in 2018, and I would say that each summit has built on the themes of the previous years and the recommendations. And so in a couple of slides, you'll see a link to the website where you can download the reports from previous summits. Here it is. Thanks, Hayo. And everything is sort of captured in those summits. The blue document, 2013 to 2016, synthesizes the first 3 summits. 2018 is separate. And this year we will produce a similar document as well to capture everything. But if you haven't read the documents and you're planning on participating in the summit, which I'm assuming because you're all on the line here, I would suggest you take a look at those in advance. It'll give you a really good sense of where we started and where we've come up to this point. So I think that might be my last slide. Oh, I can turn it over to Hayo now, I guess.
Thanks, Mary Beth. So this summit, a couple of weeks ago, it emerged that this will be an online meeting. So there's a number of groups that are working to transfer this into a productive online exchange and forum. We'll talk a bit more about the details of that at the end of the call. The key thing to recognize is that there's 5 working groups that are kind of the engine room of the Observing Summit. They're listed here. I'll just briefly review these for a minute or two to give you a flavor of the type of work that's happening there. You'll hear more about the white papers that have been submitted from Hazel later on in this call. But the key point to point out at this stage is that the output from the Arctic Observing Summit this year, 2020, is in particular directed towards the SAON roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, the SAON roads. Sandy's going to talk more about this. It'll also provide input to the 3rd Arctic Science Ministerial. And so we're both hopeful, but I have to admit also slightly anxious that we'll get the outcomes and products out of the summit that we're hoping to get. But what's been very helpful in that context is the work of the different working groups. I'm just going to briefly review these here. Working Group 1 focuses on design, optimization, and implementation of the observing system. The co-leads are Alice Bradley here from the US and Roberta Pierazzini, who's with Finnish Met Institute and the Intaros initiative, and myself. Again, this is just a snapshot of the website. If you go to arcticobservingsummit.org, you'll find more details here. But this group in particular has focused on key elements of the of helping define the SAON roadmap. Working Group 2 is chaired by Mary Beth Murray, very much focused on observing and support of adaptation mitigation at the local and global scale. Again, Mary Beth is on the call. She can answer questions about this later. Working Group 3 is co-led by Rochelle Daniel with Pew Charitable Trusts and Gunbert Redder with Sami Council, with a focus on Indigenous food security and related needs. This working group is the only one that has a very clear thematic set of objectives as well, because the broader Arctic Observing Summit recognized food security and related information needs as a key aspect that brings together different groups of those who are making observations and those in need of observations for decision making. And this group has been meeting for quite some time. Of course, you mentioned this earlier, Sandy, they're also the ones, because of participation from a lot of remote communities across Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Scandinavia, they're the ones who are most impacted and most affected by the threats of COVID-19. So we need to recognize that as well. Theme 4, Peter Pulsifer, data interoperability and federated search. Peter's going to talk more about that. There's a number of people on this call who can inform this as well. But here the idea has always been to interface with SAON's Arctic Data Committee and the Polar Data Forum. So there's been quite a bit of effort on that end as well. And then the final working group is Arctic observations in the context of global observing initiatives. We've got Yen, Renee Larson on the call here, Eric Book as well from Eurogoose. So here the goal is how do you best tie Arctic observing coordination into global frameworks. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I'll roll straight into the roads part of this discussion, and then have time for more answers and longer discussion, as I said, towards the end of the meeting. So as Hayo mentioned, the roads process is becoming very integrated with the Arctic Observing Summit this year. A little bit of background, it grows out of SAON's strategic plan from the 2018 to 2028 time period. That's where the roads process came from, where the first goal was to create a roadmap to an integrated Arctic observing system. The second goal, which Peter's group, the ADC especially focuses on, is to promote free and ethically open access to Arctic observational data, which is where the D in roads comes from. And then the kind of capstone goal of SAON over this time period is to ensure sustainability of the Arctic observing system. And we recognized that in order to do that, SAON really needed a tool to provide to policymakers and to its strategic partners to somehow optimally guide investments and observing strategies. And so collectively, these the integration of these goals all touch in some way on the roads process. SAON impaneled a task force in order to support the initial conceptual development of the roads process. That task force met last year from February through August. And the document that was submitted as a white paper to the summit is really viewed as a starting point document, and it's something that we're going to use the summit to get a lot of feedback on. But some of the principles specific to roads that are in addition to SAON's governing principles are really having an eye on complementarity and leveraging, in particular, the planning approaches that existing efforts are using. We know a lot of groups have their own roadmaps. Our group is to sort of integrate and synthesize these at a meta level so we can better speak with a collective voice to our policymakers. We know that some groups are going to be ready to go before others, thematically or regionally, and so we wanted to have a process that was going to be flexible, allow for independent kind of federated approaches, and to grow over time. And most critically, we recognize that for roads to be successful, it has to proceed in equitable partnership with Indigenous peoples, and it must engage their active participation. And so a key point here is the kind of feedback we're hoping to get from the Indigenous working group to kind of ground truth some of these ideas in the context of the summit. So we've talked about this document, the societal benefit framework that SAON has developed in the past, and I just want to break down a couple elements that you'll hear about in the context of these different working groups that Hayo just described and what kinds of things they might be thinking about vis-a-vis the roads process. So this workshop report from 2017 outlined 12 specific societal benefit areas that were relevant to the Arctic specific societal benefit areas. And those were broken down into 160 key objectives that could be addressed by an observing system. We view this tool and other tools like it as a very valuable constraint on how we understand that we've got a network that's serving societal benefit and that's being integrated in support of these objectives. We know when we look at the elements that make up, oops, pardon me. We know that when we make up look at the elements that make up the observing system itself, reading from right to left in the chart, the satellite constellations, the in-situ observations, the community-based observing systems, that they feed forward in a value tree through intermediate products and services in value-added ways. And what we really need to try to do a better job of is linking the observations that we have, the observations that we need, with the kinds of key objectives that we've identified to support societal benefit. And the tool that we view as critical, and here are just a few examples, is this concept of essential Arctic variables, or you could also think of them in the sense of essential Arctic processes, as being a tool that both gives us a mediated place where we can bring communities of practice together to integrate observing system requirements in support of societal benefit, but also a meaningful way for us to link back to the global networks that also use these essential variable concepts. So I'm going to post these slides on the website. There's a few more details. But as Hayo broke down, the working groups are going to be looking at these concepts like essential variables across a variety of independent and joint working group efforts. And then we're also going to need to think about some kind of a structured model to organize and document what we learned from this process. And so we've looked to the data team and some of the other teams to support this part of the work. So in the interest of time, I will stop there. And as I said, we'll have more Q&A later, and these slides will be posted on the website as well.
Great, thank you, Sandy. I think Peter will go ahead and roll into your presentation if you're ready.
I am, if you'll just bear with me a moment while I screen share and let me know if you see my screen.
Yep, that's working.
Okay. All right, thanks all for attending and for your attention. And like the others, I'll try and go through this as quickly as I can in the interest of time. Please feel free, though, we have a few minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. So as previously suggested, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the international activities and in relation to IARPC as well that are taking place through the Arctic Data Committee, but also other partners, as I'll point out. To start, I'm just going to very quickly go over a review of some of the past activities for those of you who are not familiar with some of the things that have been going on within the Arctic and broader polar data community. I won't talk about any of these in great detail, but going back in actually relatively recent history to the beginning, just before the International Polar Year in 2006, we started off with a big workshop kicking off the International Polar Year. But since then, we've had many, many other activities. And so what really happened, I think, is the International Polar Year, IPY, really pushed us forward in terms of coordination and trying to work together as a global community. And this leads right up into the Arctic Observing Summit that will happen in a couple of weeks' time. What I have done recently with a colleague of mine, Sandra McCubbin, is we've been looking at the reports from these various workshops and activities. So we have a whole bunch of different documents that we've looked at and some others that are still pending analysis from the International Polar Year. And I won't go into the details, but we come up with some pretty high-level themes and then some sub-themes within that. And we're working on a paper to share these results. But really, we see two broad themes. So the first is the work around social and organizational, including community building and coordination, this type of activity, in fact. A lot of discussion, of course, about funding and resourcing, engaging our Arctic indigenous peoples, governance, et cetera. And then on the technical side, this broad theme of interoperability that implies things like standards, data discovery, and federated search. So how do we try and find the data without having to go to multiple different portals and all of that, data access and archiving. So these are the themes that we as a community have been working on and trying to make progress on. In terms of current activities, some of these are being done through the Arctic Data Committee, which is a body of the International Arctic Science Committee, or IASC, as well as SAONS, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. So we were formed late in 2014. So we're still a relatively new organization, but have tried to be active, particularly in bringing together the community. So it's not strictly the Arctic Data Committee, but we have many different organizations and activities, and not all of them are listed in the text on the left-hand side, but some have already been mentioned, like the WMO's Global Cryosphere Watch, the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure, many different indigenous organizations and activities going on in that space, and so on. Some of these are domain specific, so things like OBIS and GBIF are global facilities and related to biodiversity, and we have others, you know, around permafrost, et cetera, and all kinds of different themes. So not all are general, some are very specific. And then we have various national, international activities like CCADI that Shannon Christopherson mentioned, the Canadian consortium that is focused on Canada, but linking to international activities, SIOS, and then of course, IARPIC, USAON, National Science Foundation activities. So we have a lot happening, many different groups, organizations, but we've been doing, I think, a good job of bringing these people together and trying to work together towards common goals. The Polar Data Forum series has been important. So that's been more of a conference historically, but the most recent one held in 2019 in Helsinki was focused on not only conference and knowledge sharing, but also we had hackathons. So people who are actually there writing code, particularly around federated search, semantics, and so on. So we're moving into, I think, another phase where we're still talking about things, we're still thinking about strategy and approaches, but we're also rolling up the sleeves and getting work done through the kind contribution of many funded projects in this space. Some general activities that we're doing are around community building and broader context. So we're not just talking about technical, but we're also talking about policy and things like that. We have a group called Polder. I'm not going to go into any details on these at the moment, but we can have questions if you're interested. But this is the group that's focusing on the federated search. So how do we connect the various catalogs so that we can discover the data more easily and interoperably? There's also the group that Ruth Dewar mentioned that she's a co-lead of, called the IARPIC, ADC IARPIC Scatum Vocabularies and Semantics Working Group. So one of the big challenges to getting systems to talk to each other, to work together in an interoperable way, is what are the vocabularies or the terms being used and all of that. It's one thing to share the information, it's another thing to actually understand what's being shared. So there's a lot of work happening in this space, and increasingly we're making progress because of the various funded activities that are happening at national levels and some of the international activities as well. So in terms of next steps, that is where we lead into the AOS, or the Arctic Observing Summit, that'll happen soon. So Hayo's already mentioned there's a sub-theme 4 that's looking at data interoperability and federated search. In guess about a couple of weeks' time from today, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, in a couple of weeks, we'll be holding that summit, and there'll be a number of keynotes as well as working sessions that'll be related to this topic. Really what we're trying to do in the sub-theme 4 is, first of all, to, as a group, review and confirm the priorities based on those past and current activities that I talked about. Are there major gaps, et cetera? We're going to integrate the submitted white papers, and I'll just very quickly go over those white papers in a few slides. Discuss and establish the strategies and methods to address white paper subthemes. So we have things brought up like end-to-end systems, documenting the system, et cetera. So how do those fit in? Are those already represented? If not, how do we ensure that those are represented? And then working together to draft a statement similar to what the group did for the AOS in 2018. What we did there was we created a deliverable statement for the Arctic Science Ministerial, focused on developing an interoperable architecture for an international interconnected Arctic data system. So we've been using that as a way to guide our activities over the last couple of years, and I think we found that quite productive and useful. So I'll be aiming to bring people together to do that again this AOS. Very quickly, the white papers. So we have a number of different white papers, one focused on autonomous sea ice mass balance observation and actual systems. And I won't go into the details, but the general theme there is how do we design end-to-end systems that can go right from the sensor right through to a data repository? What do we need to do there and move the data from the sensor right on through? We have a description of the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, or ABDS. So there, the general theme is how do we ensure that we connect from these larger systems that are more general into these domain-based systems and make sure that all of those data are discoverable and accessible. Another that's an interesting one that's looking at artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. So that has a couple of sub-themes. I think one is how do we incorporate model output into our data ecosystem, not strictly the raw data, but also model output, as well as thinking about these new technologies and methods such as the AI and machine learning that's becoming more and more important in this space. Copernicus, there's a paper on that. So here the general theme is, how do we document the data system? They talk about a paper that they've worked on, or a study to evaluate what's out there with respect to Copernicus, but also general theme of how do we establish the stable programs, which is really relevant to the entire topic or the entire discussion at AOS. And then lastly, and I think Bill Manley's going to talk a little bit about this, is documenting the observing system itself. So we've had a lot of focus on documenting the data and how do we get metadata and catalogs working in that way, but how do we actually know what the system looks like, the sensors, et cetera. And this also relates to that idea of designing an end-to-end system. So one of the things that we'll be talking about there, Bill and I have had some conversations. I've also had some discussions with Sandy about this, is there's an activity in the data community called Mapping the Arctic Data Ecosystem, just published a chapter on it. We also have a tool that's been developed that uses what's called linked open data. So it's a particular way of sharing network data. And what we're doing is we're being able to see and query the system. In this view that you have here, we have several views that we've developed, but this one is a view of the different catalogs that are in the system. I think we have over 80 that have been developed. Ruth Duer has been a lead in that effort through Polder and has provided the data for the visualization here. But what this tries to do is help us understand how things are connected, not connected, and so on. So we're moving from just kind of a general sort of ad hoc thought of what the system is to something that's a bit more documented, and that would lead into things also like more automated approaches to this. At the moment, we've been doing it more on expert knowledge, but we definitely want to move into more automated approaches. So this is something we may also be able to leverage for the type of work that Bill's leading on documenting the actual observing system. So just as a sum up, here is what we're thinking about for in the theme 4. So those are the points I brought up earlier, but we have questions like, sorry, there's a missing question mark there, but do we have major gaps with respect to the social and organizational or technical themes we've talked about? How are we situated relative to other activities and reports in terms of the white papers that have been submitted? Developing strategy and methods to address these issues brought up in the white papers. So what's some thinking around development of end-to-end systems or integrating new technologies, et cetera. And then lastly, the drafting of the statement. And some thinking there we need to do is target distribution. So there's the third Arctic Science Ministerial, but there may be others that we want to highlight in terms of making sure we get it out there. So with that, I'll just say, please join us at the AOS. And I think Hayo and others have put up the site, and we can probably put that up again at the end of the meeting. But for now, I think we may still have a few minutes left for questions, or I'm happy to defer those and have general question period at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. This is Jonathan. So we have to cut back on questions. We can take one or two. We have one in the chat. But before we go to that one, does anybody on the phone want to ask Peter a question? Alessa, if you're on the phone, maybe you could, instead of us reading your question, you could just speak to that, please. Okay, so it says, with respect to data I think we need to rethink requirements and interoperability. We're bottlenecked in terms of demographics. Peter, you can read the comment as well.
I'm seeing it. So happy to talk about that. I don't know if we have the time to go into depth here, but that's the kind of thing that we want to be discussing. Has been discussed, but we always want more feedback, more input. And then I think Lowell's highlighted a really big issue here as well, which is, not everyone in the community knows about this activity. We do have issues there in terms of getting it out there into the broader domain. We're working on that in terms of trying to find more resources to improve the communications as well, and then trying to engage people in things like the AOS and related activities. But I think she's highlighted something that's a really critical thing, and we're still at relatively early stages in this, but we do need to deal with that as soon as we can.
And I think there's another flip side to that same coin is getting systems that are usable, that people can go in, kind of like they're familiar with using Google, and really making use of some of these semantics and for knowledge management. If we keep working in the theoretical space, it's going to be hard for us to get community buy-in to these tools.
Yeah, and I think where I'm seeing the most sort of progress and traction is in concrete projects and so-called use cases. So I'm finding this CCADI that I'm part of, this Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, because we have a focused set of scientific use cases and some technical team and so on. We're starting to make really good progress, not on everything, but on some key things. And so I think the more that we can do that, have these initiatives, there's, NSF Arctic Data Center, NSIDC, all these entities that are working on these things. But I think Will makes a really good point, and what we've been trying to do through Arctic Data Committee is bring these organizations together. So at the moment, we've focused on a lot on bringing the big international organizations, which I would argue probably 5 or 7 years ago were not working as well together or as closely. And I think we're making progress there, but there's always room for a huge amount of improvement.
Okay, thank you. We'll have some more time at the end to discuss, but let's move on with our agenda. Sorry.
Okay, great. I think that would be passing it off to me. So let me go ahead and get my screen share going. There we go. So again, my name is Hazel Shapiro, and I am the US AON Program Assistant, and also working with the AOST, the Arctic Observing Systems sub-team within IARPIC. So I was asked by the AOST chairs to read through the white papers that have been submitted to the Arctic Observing Summit, and specifically looking at the US contributions as a way to try to understand how to best support the community generally on topics that they think are important. So that's sort of the goal of this presentation, is to understand what sort of things have been submitted and how best can we engage. And so these are some questions that I'll have up again at the end, but just to think about during this presentation. So what sort of things should the AOS team be thinking about in the year ahead, and who could we be partnering with? I'm also fairly new to this space, so the benefit of that, I guess, is that I have a fresh set of eyes on some of these things, but I may miss some of the specifics or mispronounce a name here or there. So if I do, please feel free to hop in, open to feedback. So just diving in with, these were the key questions that the co-chairs and I came up with to understand the AOS papers as a whole and to give some insight into that. I'll let you read through that list. Oops. But one thing I would say there is we had wanted to understand the various agency linkages, but in most of the papers, they were not that clearly spelled out. There were a few that were very specific, but understanding that that was not going to be something we could find across the board, I did not answer that question. So, oops. Let's see. So the first question I was looking at was basically who's working with who. So out of the 50-some papers that were submitted, at least, 29 had at least one US contributor. So for the rest of this talk, I'll be only focused on that set of 29. One moment. Okay, sorry about that. How do I move forward? Oh gosh. There we go. So more than a third of those that were coming out of the US had at least one international contributor. And really the heaviest lifts in terms of international collaboration were coming out of well-established intergovernmental collaborative bodies, which makes sense because it does take so much background work to be able to make that happen. So it really does underscore the value of those organizations. And you'll see some examples there of the papers that represent that. And for the purposes of this presentation, I really just put subjects rather than full titles, just for the sake of brevity. The next question we had wanted to know was sort of where are people working and what kind of questions are they trying to answer. But the sort of geographic distribution ended up not being that informative. So I've broken it down instead on sort of thematic focus. So you'll see these different topics, and a lot of these actually are represented also within other IARPC sub-teams or other IARPC teams. So for instance, there were 2 submissions within the sort of oceans bucket that have some overlap with the new physical oceanography team, for instance. You could imagine some collaboration with the permafrost team, et cetera. In terms of methodology, these were some of the key themes that I pulled out. So co-production of knowledge, overarching techniques and frameworks for collaboration, and Bill Manley will get a chance to talk about his talk or his white paper a little later on. And then there was a lot of work on some really innovative monitoring partnerships and community-based monitoring. One thing I wanted to highlight on this slide was the submissions from the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So you'll see that really bumps up. They had 6 papers submitted, most of which were focus groups getting feedback specifically from Indigenous communities. They were really very valuable papers, and it really bumps up that co-production of knowledge section and the amount of information we have coming in about Indigenous communities and food sovereignty. Let me close that. Another question we wanted to look at was funding generally. So I won't get into this too specifically, but we had pulled out 8 papers that were really specifically seeking funding in this round, or in some cases they were new projects, and in other cases, for instance, the Global Terrestrial Network for Permafrost was looking to fund a few additional positions. Whoops. So yeah, I'll let you read that quickly. And then if there were any that we missed there are authors online that is what they were hoping for and we didn't pull that out. Please feel free to bring that up at the end. This ties back into what Sandy was talking about earlier. So these societal benefit areas, which came out of a lot of work that went into this International Arctic Observations Assessment Framework. So basically, as I read the papers, what I did is after I finished reading a paper, would look back at this list of societal benefit areas and try to pick out one or two, and sometimes there were 3 or 4 that were most closely tied. And then I just bolded and made the ones bigger that had sort of the higher representation. So it was not a particularly scientific process. It would have been better had we had individual authors self-identifying. So if there are authors on the call that want to think about which of these they feel are most closely tied to their papers, that would be interesting to hear about. But you see the 2 that really pop out the strongest is fundamental understandings of Arctic systems, which makes sense if you're looking at observing systems. And also resilient communities was really, really heavily represented throughout the white papers, which is great to see. And this sort of ties into our final question, which is, are the papers focused on user engagement? There's been a ton of conversation, both about engaging the scientific community and also about engaging local and indigenous communities. And it was very, very, this topic of conversation was really strongly reflected in the white papers. And sometimes it was very clearly defined, and other times it was mentioned, but not in a very detailed way. So I just wanted to call out a couple examples of folks that are either an example for the community of the just like general trends in terms of user engagement, or really leading the way. So these papers here, Carolina Behe and her team have a conceptual framework for knowledge co-production, and Nora Johnson described best practices for starting community-based monitoring programs. So sort of that big picture vision, how to approach these questions. There are a few, the next 2 are really on the ground. So again, that Inuit Circumpolar Council popping out as feedback directly from Indigenous communities. And there are a few examples of community monitoring networks, and Garland's is one, and there are several others that were really interesting to read. And then this Cameron Plank's paper I wanted to pull out because it's talking about a very specific technical piece of equipment, but it's really, the whole paper is looking for engagement with the scientific community for how to make that data available. So yeah, that's just a brief summary of everything that was going through the white papers that I noticed. These slides will be posted later today on the IARPC website. And again, yeah, we're just looking to summarize the US submissions to so that we can understand how, as this team, to best support the community in their work. I know we specifically wanted to, Bill, if you want to say a few words about your paper, there's been some changes, and then we'll have a few minutes to dive into these discussion questions.
Thanks so much for your time. And it's great to see some integration and synthesis there across the white papers. So I've been invited to speak briefly, but at the same time, you can look over these discussion questions and be thinking about questions for not only this, this white paper I'll describe, but also other white papers. So I'll speak today a little bit about a working group that's spinning up to improve the interoperability of observing related metadata. And we're talking about here about a Polar Observing Information Interoperability Working Group. Kind of a mouthful there, but so that's draft working group title actually. But the idea is that there is growing interest in momentum moving from multiple directions.
Hey
to
Bill,
know...
sorry to interrupt. There's a little bit of
Sure.
background noise. If everyone can make sure that their phones are muted, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great, thanks. There's more interest recently, I think, in knowing who is doing what, where, and when in terms of measurements, ongoing or otherwise, by observing systems. and that it would help to have a broader assessment or sharing of information across networks, and that this would help link observations to essential variables and societal benefit areas and to clarify directions. So there has been progress with inventories, for example, through EU PolarNet, CEAN-CON, what Intaros is doing, AUS, and AOV. But the real challenge is that detailed information about observing activities and assets are distributed, fragmented across many organizations and systems. So essentially, it's currently impossible to know comprehensively who is measuring what, where, and when, and how. And so, fortunately, there are lessons learned from progress that's been made over the last decade in the Arctic data community, to make data set level metadata more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the FAIR principles. But in this case, we're talking about applying those lessons learned beyond the data set level with higher order information, basic information about things like networks, observing sites, observing stations, research projects, and more. So come together on compatible metadata standards and controlled vocabularies and web service protocols and techniques for interoperability of information across and among networks, allowing networks to showcase their activities, and also make it easier for networks to build and share their information, to showcase and contribute their information, and overall to help identify gaps and clarify directions. So this working group is just about to start up. It will be under CEAN Committee on Observations and Networks, CEAN-CON, and it will work very similar to how the Federated Search and Semantics working groups have worked under CEAN ADC. And there's a white paper that some of us submitted to AOS, and you're welcome to look at that, and we appreciate feedback. Just know that that white paper is just a starting point, and as we come together, there'll be vetting and brainstorming and more. So a core group of us are doing some things to prepare thoughtfully before launch, and in particular, we want to help identify and personally invite possible participants from specific networks. And we're looking, it looks like the participants should be individuals who are familiar with network assets, as well as having familiarity or an interest, just an interest in metadata management. It will be pretty technical, but it's all good. And then, in other words, network managers or observing system coordinators, network data managers, and specialists in metadata interoperability. And you know, this is different than the data world and data scientists a little bit, and that's good. So, and we'll focus on some networks that already have catalogs or portals.
So Phil, I'll just transition. Thank you for your update since the white paper, and transitioning us back to the discussion questions to say that this is a really good example of something that came out of the white papers that we would like to use our IARPIC teams to foster moving forward. And so thanks for that, the work you've done and the great progress made. And for others on the call, especially those who wrote papers, we are interested in hearing from you on this point as well. We being principally myself, Will, and Sally with the observing team, but knowing that we might also be working jointly with the data team on some of these topics. So the floor is open, and we have time for a couple points in discussion before moving on.
Yeah, let me just reiterate what Sandy said. Hazel, thank you for that analysis. you may be one of the few people who have dug into all of those papers in detail. But I think one of your last slides there, the one that was boldest, was the functioning of our understanding of Arctic systems. So, based just on that analysis, is that what people think the data team and the AOSS team should be doing over the next year? And can we refine that a little bit? I mean, you had a long list of things there, but understanding the Arctic system seemed to jump out. That's rather broad. It's not very specific, and it doesn't provide us with much of a roadmap. Any thoughts?
So this is Mike Brady. I don't want to divert the conversation too much away from your point, but I think drawing from Alessa's critique here and what Jonathan was mentioning about expanding user engagement and diversity of this community, I think we should be cautious when thinking, using words like priorities coming out of the AOS in terms of driving our efforts going forward. Clearly, there are some, not everyone's part of the AOS, and that, that makes us, should make us cautious that we're not representing all the values and priorities coming out of the communities that we support, including non-scientific communities.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think that that's our intention at all. I mean, we are simply a vesicle for all your thoughts and ideas, and a way to connect and knit together the federal agencies with contribution from non-feds. So I don't feel that any of the ARPIC groups are necessarily pushing an agenda. I think we want to make sure that everybody understands what's happening to the extent that we can, and understand that we do unfortunately miss some groups, but would welcome them to contribute. So if that was the impression I gave, I apologize, but I think we want to be as open across demographic groups and as open to ideas as we possibly can.
Yeah, I guess maybe, Mike, what you're talking about is a point that I had made in the talk. And I think rather than driving agendas, maybe the point of this is more to just sort of see where the discussion already is within this specific community, and see if there's some way that we can be helpful.
Yeah, and maybe to critique it through the lens of environmental intelligence. We need the users involved. It's not just relevancy of the work we do for user communities and stakeholder communities. It's also, establishing buy-in, which is an ongoing process that necessitates interaction with those users in the process. So kind of that co-production of method, not just thinking of co-production of knowledge, which I know is a prominent theme, especially when working with indigenous communities in the Arctic, but co-production of data and information is also, a method that is strongly a part of developing environmental intelligence systems. So I think, I plan on being a broken record as I find my place in this community. I think that, while the work that's already happening is great, I'm trying to find where I can provide, offer some value. And I think just, constantly reminding everyone that, the user community engagement is an ongoing process and should be a sustained process. So I don't mean to be too critical, but that's where I think myself and also the broader data team, as far as the objectives, as far as I understand them, can add some value. So potentially thinking about the data team work as an outreach arm. So aligning more with some of the broader outreach activities that ARPIC has planned, maybe being a liaison with the other teams, Arctic Observing and Environmental Intelligence, really pushing that envelope with respect to engaging users and stakeholders, understanding it's an ongoing process.
This is Jonathan. I just add to that, we have a number of existing Arctic data systems. So we might just start by doing sort of a survey of what your various user engagement plans are. There might be a lot already underway. So we're not assuming that that isn't occurring. We just want to develop kind of a comprehensive assessment of that as part of our data team moving forward.
Any other comments?
Well, I would just quickly say, I heard two things between the presentation and the discussion. One is something Hazel highlighted, that there are these two very kind of big picture ocean observing system submissions to the Arctic Observing Summit. And I think it's really fortuitous that we have this new physical oceanography self-forming team. And we've already kind of started a background conversation about potentially having a meeting or two jointly with them around those topics. The other point is getting to the Mike and Jonathan's observation. On the second to last slide, I think one of the things we saw was that a lot of the papers submitted to the Arctic Observing Summit were methodologically oriented with significant content focused on user engagement. And so to me, that's indicative that, you know, Mike's comments, they are attuned to the submissions to the summit. I don't think they're off the wall at all. And that's the kind of conversation that we can support and foster, kind of best practices and different kinds of conceptual frameworks. So at least in my head, I see some ideas of how we can take this synthesis and formulate some meetings around it.
Great. Well, I do want to leave some time. I know people are curious about the AOS logistics, and we have a few other topics. So maybe it's a good time to make that transition.
Yeah, but how about we go straight to logistics, and with time remaining, I know some people need to get off at the bottom of the hour. With time remaining, we can do some updates.
Great.
So do you want me to jump in with that conversation, Hazel, Sandy?
Yeah, I think that would be great, an update from where things are on your end.
Okay, thanks. So where we're at is, I'm just gonna share a document with you that's a draft outline of the current plan for the online version of the Observing Summit. So you'll see that we have a mix of pre-recorded plenary presentations and keynotes. We have live panels, and we have, most important, or as one key important aspect, both live working group breakout sessions and a couple of live poster sessions. There's a larger group working hard on getting this into a time frame that works for all involved, because we're spread out pretty much over the whole globe in terms of time zones. So that's a bit of a challenge, but this is coming together well. And we anticipate that next Monday, we'll have a draft version of the online agenda posted and accessible through the Arctic Observing Summit website. And that'll give you sort of a better sense of how this whole thing is going to pan out. You know, I'm just scrolling through here, so you get some sense of how this will work. For this group, I think there's a sort of a plea or a request for you, if you're interested in the broader topics that are part of the summit, please engage and understand that, this is not, if we would have designed this as an online meeting from the ground up, it would look very different. And it would, would have been a different process. But I feel that because these working groups have built up substantial momentum, that we're able to drag everything or move everything over into an online version. But the question then is, well, where can you participate, or what type of contributions would be helpful? look at the different working groups, both in terms of their descriptions, who are the people who are working on there. They will focus very specifically on helping define the SAON roadmap and actually then help figure out how follow-up activities are going to result in better coordination, better collaboration of observation activities that are already ongoing. So it's basically this consolidation or better linking of existing activities. That's the key point here. In terms of the specifics of the logistics, let me share a different document here real quick. So what we're doing is we're essentially having sort of 5 different columns of interaction, if you will, that range from the AOS website that will have the more detailed information, through Zoom, where much of the face-to-face or direct interaction in the working groups, the poster sessions will take place. So you can see that here. Through a YouTube channel that'll capture all the pre-recorded and recorded material, over to a Google Drive where some of the products that are expected to come out of the summit will be curated. And then finally, that there'll be some associated communications through Twitter. So that's essentially the sort of the broader framework. I don't know whether you want me to delve more deeply into any of this, but I'd be happy to take questions, or I'd be happy for Maribeth, Sandy, others on the call who are part of the effort here to chime in as well.
Hi, this is Jonathan. Okay, I didn't know about this this meeting till a month ago, and now that it's online, so to speak, it sounds like it's something I might be able to participate in, whereas the travel before would have been inhibited that. So this could be an opportunity for me and other people in my situation. How open are those? What Zoom meetings? Is that open to everybody? Do you expect those will be sent out to participants?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. And that's what we see as a major opportunity as well, is that people who wouldn't have been able to participate otherwise now can. So the Zoom meetings are open. They don't require the AOS website will be open, and the entry page will have links to all the various working group Zoom meetings, as well as any other Zoom-based interaction. Now, again, because this really only emerged over the course of the past 2 weeks, the organizers, the local organizers in Iceland, who've done a fantastic job in putting all of this together and now see themselves faced with, hey, there is no physical in-person meeting, have requested that in using the honor system, that people who actively participate in the Observing Summit register through their website. I checked last night, they hadn't posted the actual fee and the link for online participation registration yet, but they indicate it's going to be a modest sum. That's just because there is cost associated with running all of this. So that's the answer to your question.
Okay, hi, Matt had requested in the chat to see that document again, if you could.
And I'm
the one with
let me
Twitter.
get that. Yeah, okay. And if you say that document, are you referring to this document here?
Exactly. I was just reading through it, trying to see all the options. Is that available somewhere online?
It will be. I mean, right now, again, I mean, there's a bunch of people working on this. This is a draft, so I'm not comfortable sharing that yet, because some key aspects of this may change. But this will be posted online in the next few days.
And Hayo, perhaps you can post on the IARPIC site when it's up and ready. Yes,
yeah, that was the plan, because I mean, again, I appreciate Lil's comments in terms of, hey, you know, there's a whole bunch of people out there who may not be aware of this. You know, Jonathan mentioned this as well. And so now we have an opportunity to better reach that broader group. That's what we're trying to figure out, how to best do that. And clearly IARPIC is going to be an important channel, if you will, to share that information as well. So we'll be posting more details through the IARPIC collaboration teams, and we're definitely open to other suggestions on where or how to best disseminate the information. The one, I mean, at the same time, you know, we are, and that's something that you can pass on. I mean, what we're worried about is, and maybe it's a small worry, but you know, what we wouldn't be able to accommodate is if suddenly, you know, these working group breakout sessions are populated by like 150 people or 200 people who just want to sort of see, hey, what's going on here, but don't really have an intent to participate in the process. You know, that could be disruptive. Whereas, you know, what we're hoping is that we can bring in people who are willing to put in some time, you know, not sit through a whole 2 days of meetings, but at least say, okay, I'm going to join a particular working group because I'm interested in the topic, and then I'll follow that group over the course of the summit, you know, which will be a modest time involvement. You know, if you add up the individual working group breakout sessions, that would add up to about 5 hours to 6 hours total. But then you would have a say in some of the products that are going to come out of that.
Hi, this is Sandy. Are you still looking for volunteers for note-taking, synthesis, or monitoring the Zoom?
Yes, with some qualifications. So we are, you know, because we have these larger numbers now of parallel sessions that all require, if you will, people who are affiliated with them. If you are interested in particular note-taking, so note-taking does require a bit more sort of expertise, which of course this group has, you know, but if you have a student or somebody else working with you, that would be an opportunity. Or some of the more mundane tasks, such as, well, I should say mundane, I mean, because frankly, you know, right now with the communications, that's the key thing, is managing communications during these meetings, you know, which is the challenge, as we all know. And if you have a meeting with like potentially 60, 70 participants where you want, you know, we will have things set up so that we'll have breakout groups of smaller numbers of people that are branching off of Zoom. I mean, all of that's going to require some management. So yes, if you have specific interests or ability, please send an email to myself, and then I'll forward that to the team that's organizing all of this.
Super. Well, it sounds like we can point people towards the AOS, ASSW websites and IARPIC for updates on this information, and presumably people could contact you, though I imagine you're probably pretty overwhelmed with emails at the moment too.
Yeah, I mean, contact myself, or, you know, you have Mary Beth Murray, Ravi Sankar working out of University of Calgary. Ravi couldn't join today. He's been instrumental. So the whole website aspect of this is managed out of Arctic Institute of North America. Those are sort of the starting points. But if you do know some of the working group leads, you know, they're listed on the website, but if you feel comfortable just contacting them directly, that may help you if you have interest in a very specific working group. Because again, I mean, this is all, there's a lot of things in flux. I feel confident that by mid next week, we will have a much better framework that's accessible to everybody in terms of information about how this is going to run. That'll give us another week to really prepare in more depth to make sure these breakout sessions are productive. But I have to say, I mean, I'm excited and encouraged by seeing such a large group of participants here today. In my mind, this is a fantastic opportunity for us to also figure out, is this something that, in particular, if we have more time to plan in advance, that we can use more effectively, you know, because it is in many respects more inclusive. There's some challenges, but in general, how this meeting unfolds, and we know, you know, we're gonna hit a lot of bumps, you know, things are gonna go wrong, but there's also gonna be good stuff coming out of it. I'm certain the lessons we can draw from that, I think will help us in the Arctic research community for a number of other things as well.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who's working so diligently behind the scenes to pull off a successful observing summit. I concur with your takeaways about the potential benefits. We are at the bottom of our hour. Maybe what I would suggest is those who had updates that they weren't able to share, that they post them in the comment box from this meeting, so that everyone who signed up for the meeting can see those comments. And so just handing this off at this point to the other co-chairs for any of their closing comments.
No comments. Thanks, everyone. That was a really good joint meeting, and particularly a good setup for the Observing Summit, which is coming up. So thanks to those who contributed.
Yeah, this is Jonathan. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk later.
Okay, I think that's a wrap then. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe out there, and we'll hope to see you at the Observing Summit.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks.